We are starting with Parak Chav Gimel, and hopefully Chav Gimel this week, Chav Daled next week. That's the plan. Vahim Yamim Rabim, many years passed, days, years. Usually Yamim Rabim means years. Acharei asher hiniach Hashem liYisrael mikol oivehem misaviv. So years after God had already given them rest from all of their battles and all of their enemies, a phrase we've seen a few times, we're going to come back to it a little bit later, that its first appearance is in the Chumash, and then it appears a few times in Yehoshua. Reflection on the whole campaign, the battle, the conquest, the settlement of Canaan. And now, years later, Yehoshua is at the end of his life. Yehoshua Zaken Ba Bayamim. Yehoshua has reached the end of his life, and he's going to, at this point, issue his farewell to the people. There are two chapters in which Yehoshua issues his farewell. This one, and as we'll see, I'm going to jump quickly to Perach Chav Daled for a moment. Vayasof Yehoshua et kol shiftei Yisrael shchema vayikra leziknei Yisrael. He comes, he brings all the elders and all the people to Shechem for a final message to the people. So one of the questions we'll have to explore is, why is he kind of summarizing the campaign in his life? Why is he issuing a farewell speech twice? Which is an interesting question. He's not the first to divide his final remarks into two speeches or two presentations. Moshe Rabbeinu did that as well in the end of Chumash, where you have the final Brit, and then you have V'zot HaBracha as a kind of a postscript. That similar kind of division you have here. Yehoshua has two presentations, one here and one in Chav Daled, and we'll explore the difference between. Many years later, Yehoshua is old, and the campaigns are over. Vayikra Yehoshua l'chol Yisrael lizkenav u'leroshav u'leshoftav u'leshotarav. Yehoshua calls over all of Israel, the zkenim, the elders, the rashim, the heads, u'leshoftav, the judges. I'm going to come back to that phrase in a moment. Shotrav, the officers. Vayomer alehem. He says to them, Ani zakanti ba'ati bayamim. I am old, advanced in years. You have seen all that God has done to the nations before you. Because it has been God that has fought for you, with you. I have allotted for you as an inheritance. I have allotted to you for an inheritance these nations that remain. From the Jordan to the Mediterranean, all of these nations, those that have been left, those that still have to be conquered, I have apportioned them to the various tribes. God will remove them from before you, and drive them from before you, and you shall possess their land, as God has promised. So the job is not 100% finished, but rest assured God will finish the job as he has led you, guided you up until this point. You have to be courageous and strong and to do all that is written in the Torah. Small, not to veer from it right or left. Not to enable these nations that remain to come amongst you. You shall not mention their gods, you shall not take oaths by their gods. You certainly should not serve them, or bow down to them. But you should be loyal to God. kasher asitem ad hayom hazeh, as you have until this moment. Vayorash Hashem mipnechem goyim gdolim va'atzumim. God has driven out from before you great, mighty nations. Va'atem lo amad ish bifnechem ad hayom hazeh. No man has stood before you, stood against you until this day. Ish echad mikem yirdof elef. One of you chased 1,000. Ki Hashem Elokechem hu anilcham lechem kasher diber lechem. God has fought for you. God has enabled you to be victorious, as He said. V'nishmartem me'od lenafshotechem la'avat Hashem Elokechem. You shall take heed to love God. Kim shov tashuvu udvakem beyeter hagoyim ha'ela nisharim ha'ela itchem. If you shall go back, turn back, and cleave to these nations, v'itchatantem behem, and marry them, uvatem behem vehem bachem, and you join them, and they will join you, and one big happy family of nations. Then God will not drive these nations away from before you. And they shall continue to be for you like a snare and a trap. And this translates here as a scourge in your sides and thorns in your eyes. Ad avadchem me'ala adama tova azot asher natan Hashem lechem Hashem Elokechem, until you will be removed, perished from this land. V'hinei anochi olech hayom b'derech kol haaretz. It's time for me to go the way of the land. It's time. It's the end of my life. V'yida'atem b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem, and know with all your heart and with all your soul. Not one thing that God has promised has He failed to keep. Everything has come to pass. Not one thing has failed. Just as all the good that God has promised has taken place, so too God will bring upon you all the calamities. Until the point of destroying you from upon this land, if you transgress the covenant with God that He has commanded. And if you go and worship other gods and bow to them, God will be angry at you, and He will remove you from this land, good land which He has given you. Phrase which jumps right out of the page of Kriyat Shema as well. And that's the end of the speech. Like, it's not one of these kind of happy-go-lucky speeches here. It kind of ends with this very heavy moment of, if you don't, then God will destroy you. But the overall message here essentially divides into essentially 3 parts. Everything that God has promised He has kept up until this point. There's still work to be done. There are still nations amongst you that need to be cleared out in terms of the creation of an idolatry-free zone in the land of Israel. And if you leave them, and if you enable and if your children end up kind of connecting with them culturally, socially, end up worshiping their gods, marrying their children, and being influenced by their deities, then all that we speak about in Kriyat Shema, v'charaf Hashem b'chem v'abadatem me'ala haaretz v'tovad, then you will be removed from this land. Everything you have is conditional. So that's the message in Parak Chaf Gimel. To really put it in perspective, we'd have to look a little bit into Parak Chaf Daled, which I don't want to do too much of today because we'll leave it for next week. But Chaf Daled is a reenactment of the entire Brit in Shechem. And again, he calls over, he calls over the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers. And he brings them to Shechem, and he speaks to the people, and he gives them all a history lesson, and then he enables or reenacts a Brit with them, which we will come to and discuss next week. There's a number of interesting parallels between Yehoshua's final message to the people And Moshe's final message in Sefer Devarim, not an accident. Yehoshua was a disciple of Moshe, and so should be surprising at all to find parallels between Yeshua's final words and Moshe. Even the opening phrase in Vayikra Yehoshua l'cho Yisrael l'ziknav u'l'roshav u'l'shoftav u'l'shotrav, calls over all of the elders, and he says to them, Ani zakanti bate bayamim, I am old, and you have seen all that God has done for you. That whole context of introducing of this final message, introduction of this final message, is taken right off the page of Sefer Devarim. I'll show you in where did I put it? What happened to it? Why did it go over here? I put it into the chart. In Devarim Parak Chavtet, which is the beginning of Pashat Nitzavim, I'll translate for you. Atem Nitzavim Hayom Kolchem Lifnei Hashem Elokechem. You stand here before God. Roshechem Shivtechem Ziknechem V'Shotrechem Kol Ish Yisrael. Your heads, your tribes, your leaders, your elders, your officers. Exactly the same phrase. Roshav L'Ziknei Yisrael, L'Roshav L'Shoftav L'Shotrav. That's in Perach of Dalet. Vayityatzu Lifnei Elokim. They stood before God, like the phrase Atem Nitzavim. Or in our Perach of Gimel, Lizkenav L'Roshav L'Shoftav L'Shotrav. Again, the same kind of summation of all of the leadership of the people. Moshe also just begins his final message with the statement, I am old, 120 years, I'm done, and God said you won't continue. And here Yehoshua essentially enables the same message. Even the content of Yeshua's message to the people in Perach Gimel has a similar sound or a similar message to that of Moshe's message to the people. He talks about how you saw all that God has done for you in removing these nations before you. And in Devarim Chavtet, that's exactly what Moshe described. Vayikra Moshe al kol Yisrael v'yom alehem, atem re'item et kol asher asa Hashem le'nechem be'eretz Mitzrayim l'Pharaoh l'chol avadav. You saw with your own eyes all that God had done in Egypt to Paro and his servants, as a kind of a opening to the commitment, to the loyalty that he's demanding of the people. The prohibition or the warning against intermarrying with these nations and enabling their cultural assimilation into the borders of, or the boundaries of Israel. If you will abandon the Brit, and if you will join these nations, and and marry amongst them, similar kind of warning was issued by Moshe in Devarim Perek Zayin, to destroy all the nations that are there and not to enable any brit with them. Not to marry their sons or their daughters, because they will lead you astray into the world of idolatry. And even the final warning that if you don't abide by this, then they will become a snare and a trap for you and a thorn in your side. Is a phrase taken directly from Bamidbar l'shikim be'enechem u'litzninim betzidechem. So the notion that Yehoshua is kind of pulling from the phraseology of Moshe's final message to the people in warning them not to enable these nations, these idolatrous nations, to remain as a influence over your people, but whether a religious influence or a social influence, is exactly the message that Moshe had reflected on in his final speech in Sefer Devarim, and that's where Yehoshua leaves this message for the people as well. I'll just compare that for a moment to the opening statement of Sefer Yehoshua. In other words, the Brit here, the commitment that he's describing here, where he warns them against enabling this idolatrous culture to remain in the land. And that's sort of the portions of the land that were yet unconquered that we've seen a few times. Right? That is essentially where Yehoshua began the whole story back in Perek Aleph. We go back to all the way to Perek Aleph, and God says to Moshe, to Yehoshua, Moshe has died. It's time for you to lead these people. No nation will stand before you. Lo yityatzeb ish lefanecha, chazak v'yamatz. Be strong, be courageous, for you will lead these people. And then in Pasuk Zayin, rak chazak v'yamatz me'od. God warns Yeshua and says to him, be very strong and courageous. Lishmor lasot gechol haTorah shetzivcha Moshe avdi, to follow the command, the Torah of Moshe. Al tasur mimenu yaminu small, not to veer from it right or left. Man taskil, so that you shall be successful in all that you do. The Torah should not depart from your mouth. To commit yourself to the mandate that the Torah presents to you. And one of the things we said at the time when we studied Perek Aleph was that this wasn't just a general comment about the importance of studying Torah, commitment to Torah, etc. This was specific to the Chazak v'Yamatz Ma'od. Right? There's a conquest of Canaan that's Chazak v'Yamatz. You are going to lead the people into this battle. And then there's a need for a Chazak v'Yamatz Ma'od, to be very strong and courageous when it comes to the loyalty that the Torah demands. Why is there an extra emphasis here? It's not because keeping Shabbos and keeping kosher requires extra courage. That's not the issue here. The issue here is specific to the mitzvah that is a subset of the mandate to conquer the land of Canaan, which is spelled out in our parak, namely, not to enable the nations of Canaan, to be very strong. And he says it again here, exactly the same phrase, be very strong, to observe the laws, not to veer from it right or left, exactly the same language we just saw in Perek Aleph, but specifically in the context of not to enable the nations that are here to assimilate and to influence your presence and to remove the idolatry from the land. And just to review briefly, I think it's important to recognize that the challenge facing Yehoshua, especially because the job's not finished, and so Yehoshua is leaving them with an unfinished mandate, which is to create this idolatry-free zone in the land of Israel. It's not about the nations remaining. The nations can choose to remain, and we talked about this back in Perek Aleph. The issue is the idolatry cannot remain. Idolatry is an immoral, abhorrent culture, and that has to be removed from the land. But that will take generations. That's not just the kind of thing that can happen in a day or a year or 5 years. Even the conquest, which was finished in 14 years, did not enable this completely. And it will take hundreds of years, because the whole story of Sefer Shoftim is the back and forth of the influence of the Canaanites, and exactly the fear that Yehoshua faces here, that's exactly the story of Sefer Shoftim. And the fear was real, and it will take almost till the days of Shmuel HaNavi. It will take almost 300, close to 400 years from this point before one could make the claim that the land of Israel has been freed at that moment of all idolatrous remnants. So this is the challenge that Yehoshua leaves the people with. I want to come back to the question of the dual epilogue, right? The two messages, one in Perek Gimel, one in Perek Dalet, for a moment, because I want to, because now that we have some background to understand the message of this parak, it's important to see why he needs two speeches. So here he's speaking, it seems to be the same group of people that he seems to be speaking to in the next parak. Vayikra Yehoshua l'chol Yisrael l'zkanav u'l'shoshav u'l'shoftav u'l'shotrav. He calls over all of Israel, the elders, the heads, the tribes, the officers, and he says to them, and then we have the rest of this Brit. In Perek Dalet, he is virtually the same. It's a little bit out of order, but that's okay. Perek of Daled, he has virtually the same group that he's speaking to, but Yasof Yehoshua, et kol shiftei Yisrael, gathers all of the tribes of Israel to the city of Shechem. Next week we'll talk about why Shechem. Vayikra leziknei Yisrael u'l'roshav u'l'shoftav u'l'shotrav, and he calls over the elders, the heads, and the judges and the leaders and the officers of all the tribes. Vayitzvu lifnei Elokim, they stand before God. Vayomer Yehoshua kolam, and then he starts his speech. The difference between Perek of Gimel and Perek of Daled, and I'll show it, is that whereas he gathers together Vayikra leziknei Yisrael, and he gathers everybody, the same group, Rashim, Roshav, Shoftav, Shotrav, Vayitzvu lifnei Elokim, he then turns in Perek of Daled, the next Perek, he turns to the people. Vayomer Yehoshua el kol ha'am. K'amar Hashem Elokei Yisrael. And then he begins a very long history lesson made by now Yeshua B'Tenu Me'olam. Perek of Daled is directed at the people. The elders are there, the heads of the tribes are there, the leaders are there, but his speech is El Kol Ha'am. His speech is specific to the people. Because in Perek of Daled, he's going to talk about the Brit with God. He's going to talk about a choice to be loyal to God or to leave the Brit of Torah. He's going to reenact the story of Ma'amad Sinai. And he's going to give them a choice. He's going to say to them, I'm going to jump to the end of the Perek for a moment. Now fear God. And fear and serve him with loyalty and with whole heart. And remove all of the idolatries from amongst your midst. But if you don't want to serve God, then choose today whom you will serve, God or the gods of the nations of Canaan. Choose to serve either the God of Abraham or the gods of the Canaanites. Here's your moment of choice. Choose now. So in Perek of Daled, and we'll talk about why he needs to enact that and why he needs to give them that choice. But it's clear that he's addressing the question of the loyalty of the people, the choice to be loyal to the Torah or not to be loyal to the Torah. That's a message for the entire nation of Israel, like Ma'amad Sinai, when we all stood at the foot of the mountain. Whereas Perek of Gimel, he's specifically addressing the question of the conquest of Canaan. He's specifically addressing the question of the remaining nations that have yet to be removed. And he's warning them that they're a threat to you. They're going to be a thorn in your side. You're going to have to address the question of the cultural influence, both socially and religiously. And he starts with the description of what the success of the conquest has been, and how God will continue to remove these nations from before you if you are loyal to this commitment to create an idolatry-free zone, and be very strong and courageous, like God had promised to you, had said to Yehoshua himself. In other words, the subject matter in Perek Chaf Gimel is the conquest of Canaan and whether it has been completed, and the consequences of the unfinished job of the nations of Canaan that remain. The subject matter of Perek Chaf Daled, like Ma'amad Sinai, is a loyalty to the Brit of Torah with God and Yirat Hashem. That Brit is with all of the people. The responsibility for the conquest of Canaan and the leadership and facing off with the nations of Canaan that remain is the responsibility specifically of the leadership of Israel. And hence Perek Chaf Gimel is to the leadership. Vayikra Yehoshua l'chol Yisrael lizkenav u'l'roshav u'l'shoftav u'l'shotrav vayomer alehem. Yehoshua is speaking to the zkenim, roshim, shoftim, and shotrim. Whereas in Perek Chaf Daled, he's speaking to Vayomer Yehoshua el kol ha'am. He's speaking to the people. So there's a leadership core that's always there, But Yehoshua's address in Parachav Gimel is to the leadership, because he's talking about the conquest, and they're the ones responsible for that conquest. Parachav Daled, he's talking about loyalty to God, Yirat Hashem. There he's talking to the entire nation of Israel.
Can I ask a question?
You may.
How do you justify the fact that he did not finish if Hashem is with him and Hashem is with us in conquering the nations? What happened here?
So that is a very good question. We're going to address it in a minute. So give me 1 minute and we'll come back to exactly that question. That is the core issue in this parak. Actually, Parachav Gimel. Before I get there, because I do want to get there, thank you for that question. I want to point out an observation here that's really a complete parenthetical aside, but it's fascinating to me, and it's going to become relevant to us in our study of Sefer Shoftim. So I think this is a really good place to point it out. There's a phrase here that needs to be kind of unpacked. Vayikra Yehoshua l'cho Yisrael lizkenav uleroshav uleshovtav uleshotrav. Yeshua calls together the elders, the heads, and the shoftim and the shotrim, like we have in the beginning of Parshat Shoftim, where it says shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sherecha, judges and officers, place in every city that you have. However, the word shofet here may have a different meaning altogether. Because if you look at its parallel in Chumash, I'm going to go back to the source page for a second. If you look at the parallel, in both cases, Parachav Daled and Parachav Gimel, Yehoshua calls Ziknei Yisrael Roshav Ushoftav Shotrav. And right, so you have the elders, the heads, the shoftim, whatever they mean, we'll kind of see in a second, and the shoter, the officers. Similarly, in Parachav Gimel, you have the same group. That same list in Sefer in Dvarim, in Parshat Nitzavim, says, Atem Nitzavim Hayom Kochem, Lifnei Hashem Lekachem Roshechem, Shivtechem, Ziknechem, B'Shotrechem. So your Zkanim are mentioned both places, your Shotrim are mentioned both places, but this word shifts. Shiftechem on the one hand, and Shoftav on the other. Now, what is the difference between them? Shiftechem means your tribes or your leaders of your tribes. Roshechem Shiftechem, the leaders of your tribes, like the Nasi of every tribe had a leader. And Yehoshua, it talks about Shoftim, which is normally translated as judges. So most of the Mefarshim simply translated exactly that way. This is judges and this is heads of tribes. There is a comment, however, of Shmuel David Latzato, the Shadal, that really, I think, highlights something which we're going to see in Sefer Shoftim a lot, which is that the role of the Shofet in the book of Shoftim is not the role of a judge. We translate it as judge, it's a mistake. The role of the Shofet in the book of Shoftim is a political leader, he's a military leader. He's essentially the same as the Nasi of the Shevet in the book in Chumash. So why is he called a Shofet? So here Shadal says, on the word Shiftechem, in Dvarim, he says, Kemo lo yasu shevet miYehuda. It comes from the word, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. The word Shiftechem means the leader of the Shevet. The leader of the Shevet is called a Shofet, right? The word Shevet in the context of the bracha we had in Parshat Vayechi, Yasu Shevet miYehuda, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, is a reference to the leadership, Malchus. The leadership or the scepter or the Shevet, even the word Shevet, which we translate means as tribe, but it really means scepter. It really means leadership. And it's a way of describing a family that gets together, but the head of the shevet is the leader here. Dan Yadin, and he quotes a pasuk also in this week's parasha, Dan Yadin Amo, Dan shall judge his people, Ke'echad Shivtei Yisrael, which most Mefarshim translate as Dan will be like a judge, like one of the leaders of Israel, one of the tribes of Israel. Says Shadal, no, it means that he will be a warrior, like a leader, like a shovet, like the Shavtei Yisrael from the word shevet, like the leaders of Israel. And he says it again here in Breshit Memtet, in Dan Yadin Amo Ke'echad Shiftei Yisrael. He says that Ikar HaMilah, Inyan Shavit, the name Shevet comes from the word Shavit, which means like a scepter of leadership, Memshalah. Shevet Bimkom Tomech Shevet, or Baal Shevet. And he goes on to say that that's maybe where the word Matot comes from, right? A Mateh is also a Shevet, also a tribe. Mateh Shimon, Mateh Reuven comes from Mateh as a staff, comes from the same root. It's the head of the family. And here's the key. Umin shevet nigzar hakach shoret shafat. The word shafat, as in shofet, when it means the heads of the tribes, comes from the same root as shevet. In other words, it's a kind of a lashon nefela lashon. Right? It's a kind of a play on the words, play on the letters. The word shofet almost means shovet, means the leader of the tribe. The word shofet in the book of Shoftim is a political military leader. It's not a judge in the judicial sense that it is in Chumash. So what he's done for us is he's opened up an understanding of the whole book of Shoftim, because we're going to see this word over and over again throughout the book of Shoftim, and we're not going to understand it because the word shofet as judge has nothing to do with the role that the Shoftim had in the book of Shoftim. They're military leaders, they're political leaders, they're leading the people in time. They're like Yehoshua, only they're tribal. They're connected to a tribe or to a region. Says Shadal, that's exactly right. The word shofet in this context is a borrowed term from the word shevet, or from the word shevet miuda, or in this case, Ke'echad Shiftei Yisrael. So I bring it to your attention, and here you can see it really almost for the first time, the shift from the word shiftechem to shoftechem, meaning leaders in the political military sense, not only, or even maybe not at all, in the judicial sense. Okay, that's a open parenthesis. If you followed that, great. If you didn't, don't worry about it. We will come back to it in Sefer Shoft. Okay. Which brings us to the last issue for today, which is the most important, and as was mentioned before, the key question in this parak. Yehoshua makes a very striking assertion, where he says, God has given them respite from all of their enemies. God has brought the war to an end. And he says that they have been successful in all of that they have done. God has fought for you. And there are still some nations that are left. I've divided them amongst the tribes. And now he warns them about what to do with the remaining nations, or what not to do with the remaining nations. But he says, God will remove them from your midst, and you will inherit their land. On the other hand, and this is not the first time we've seen this assertion, by the way, that we've reached the end of the period of the conquest and we've been successful in all that we've set out to do. We saw it at the end of Perek Chaf Aleph as well. If you go back to Perek Chaf Aleph is the cities, the Levite cities, and the refuge cities, this Arei Miklat and the Arei Levium. And at the very end of that Perek, we find God gave them the whole land that he promised. Yehoshua, they possessed it. Yehoshua, they dwelt therein. Vayanach Hashem lahem misaviv, and they had respite, rest from all of their enemies. Exactly as God had sworn to them, promised them. No man stood against them. God has delivered them into their hands. Nothing failed. Everything good. Everything happened. Everything came to pass. That essentially is exactly what Yehoshua has said in his opening comments here. God has given you rest from all of your enemies. God has done everything he promised. No man has stood against you. And what nations remain, God will remove. And yet he warns them against assimilation. He warns them against intermarriage. He warns them if they fail to remove them, then they will be a source of angst for you and this thorn on your side. So there's this contrast, almost contradiction between, on the one hand, what they've successfully done, and the other hand, we've seen how many times, what described here and in Perek Aleph, we've seen so many times where Yehoshua is warned about the fact that the job is yet unfinished. So is the job, to put it succinctly, is the job finished or not? Here it would seem, Perek Aleph, it seems to be that the job is finished. That's what he says at the end of the Perek, very clearly, that that everything's done. Nothing that God promised failed. And he says, in Perek Gimel, he hedges his bets a little bit. But we saw, for example, the beginning of Perek Gimel, after the whole second half of the Sefer, began with a critique of Yehoshua and a critique of the people, because the land yet remained unfinished. We saw that in Perek Gimel. And it even described which parts of the land were unfinished. Zot ha'aretz hanisheret. And it went through various parts of the land. We saw it again in Perek Yud Chet, when Yehoshua moves the Mishkan to Shiloh, and he breaks up the camp and the Mishkan from Gilgal, because vayivatru b'vnei Yisrael asher lo chalku et nachalatam, because there were tribes that were yet not done with their mission. And Yehoshua calls them over. Vayomer Yehoshua b'nei Yisrael ad ana atem mitrapim levo lereshet haaretz. How long will you procrastinate? How long will you slack in your mandate to go and conquer and settle this land that God has given you? So he sets them on a mission. We'll see also at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, a couple of weeks, that's exactly how the book of Shoftim begins. There's a malach that comes to them. Actually, if you start with Perek Aleph, the whole message of Perek Aleph is all the parts of the land that have yet, it's a summary of Sefer Yehoshua. It's the parts that have not yet been conquered. Ephraim lo horish, Zebulun lo horish, Asher lo horish, all Naphtali lo horish, all the tribes that failed to finish the job that they had started. That's how Perek Aleph begins. And in response to that, the Malach comes to them in Bochim and criticizes them and says to them, "Atem lo tichu brit b'yoshvei haaretz hazot." Stop making covenants with Brit and treaties with these nations. You have to destroy the altars. You have to destroy. V'lo shematem b'koli. You didn't listen to me. So, did they or didn't they? That's the big question. The Farshim struggle with this question. This is not new. And I gave you on the source page two examples, one from the Rabbi and one from the Abarbanel. Start from the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel says, he goes back to Perek Aleph, but it's the same message. Even though there's many parts of the land that have yet to be conquered, Amar Basof, it says at the end of the division of the cities of refuge and the cities of Levium, Shenatan Hashem lehem et kol haaretz, God has given them the whole land. So, did they conquer? Did they finish the job, or didn't they? Says the Rabbi, Lefi shema shelo kavshu haya be'atzlutam, v'lo map'at Hashem yitbarach. What they didn't finish was because of their own procrastination and their own hesitation, not from God's intention, desire, effort, and guidance. In other words, God can only bring them as far as they bring themselves. So from the perspective, and this is the answer essentially that Rabbi is offering, we'll see a similar answer in the Rabbah. From the perspective of God's mandate, God has enabled them to conquer. God has been with them on this journey. God has fought for you. God has enabled you to be successful in every campaign you fought. However, if there's land that still is to be conquered, it's not because God didn't finish the job. It's because you didn't finish the job, as we saw in Yehoshua Perak Yud Gimel. God says, where Yehoshua says to them, Ad matayat mitrapim, how long are you going to procrastinate? In other words, there's a tension created at the end of the Sefer, and that's why Yehoshua needs this speech, between what God has enabled them to accomplish and where they put the brakes on. They put the brakes on finishing the job. God can't do that for them. So to the extent that they have made the effort to conquer, to settle the land, God has enabled them to succeed. To the extent that they have procrastinated, Yehoshua holds them accountable. That's the balance. But the Barbanel is very clear that this is because of their laziness or procrastination, and not because of God. The Rabbi is a little bit less politically correct, and he says, God, nothing that God promised has fallen short. Hakoba, everything's happened. Even though they have many parts of the land still yet to conquer, as has been mentioned. That doesn't contradict what we've mentioned now, namely, God has enabled you to succeed. God has done everything He promised to do. All the nations that they fought against, fell into their hands. Nish'aru elu, these nations that remain, b'sibat atzlut Yehoshua v'Yisrael. They remain because of the laziness or the procrastination of Yehoshua and the Jewish people. Lo b'sibat te'edeh hashgachat Hashem yitbarach, not because God failed to enable them to conquer. The difference between the Abarbanel and the Rabag is in one word. Namely,
Yehoshua.
Yeshua. The Rabag holds some element of guilt for this situation on Yehoshua himself. It says whatever they haven't finished has not been finished because the people haven't done their job. Yehoshua, to an extent, hasn't finished his job. The Abarbanel wasn't prepared to go there. And he said whatever they haven't done is because of Atzlutam, to their own hesitation, and not because of Yehoshua. So it's just interesting perspective in differentiation between the two. My own personal opinion is that I think the Abarbanel's, I'm biased more to the Abarbanel's position, but there is an element of critique on Yehoshua himself that the Rabag highlights. I think you hear it a little bit in the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel. Because in the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel, Yehoshua Zaken Baba Yamim, Vayomer Hashem Elav, God is speaking to Yehoshua. And God says to him, Ata Zakanta Bata Bayamim, you are now old, Yeah, Aretz nishara habe מאוד levishta, and the land remains yet largely, to a large extent, unconquered. What does it have to do with you being old? Means this was your job, and to an extent, you didn't finish it. Now, whether the blame lays on the people or the blame lies on Yehoshua himself, that remains somewhat of a difference in perspective between the Mepharshim. That more or less, I don't know if I've completely answered the question that you asked before, but that was the address here. One other.
Yeah, it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, that now each Shevet has to conquer his own land. It's not anymore everybody else, including Reuven, Gad, V'Chatzi Menashe, who were in front of the army. It's not a big army. It's an individual.
Correct. That's been the case since chapter 13. Correct.
Yeah.
That's been the case since chapter 13. That's correct. And that's why Yehoshua turns to the remaining tribes and says, okay, it's on you. You need to go and deal with it. But as he gets to the end of the Sefer, and there are portions still remaining of Canaanite strongholds, as we see clearly at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, which summarizes exactly this issue, this is where where Sefer Yehoshua ends and Sefer Shoftim begins, with the challenge of remaining Canaanite isolated strongholds inside the land of Israel, both culturally, idolatry, and socially. And militarily, this becomes the challenge of the remaining story of Jewish history in Tanakh. And certainly the book of Shoftim, 400 years, deals with exactly this challenge. There's one other piece that I wanted to bring to your attention, and that is the only thing I'm bothered in this description, and I think the answers that both the Barbanel and the Malbim have given to how to understand this parak and the previous descriptions is correct. The concern I have is this phrase: "Vayhi b'yamim rabim acharei asher hiniach Hashem liYisrael mikol oivehem misaviv." That phrase sounds like we're done. God has given them rest from all their enemies around them. Right? That sounds like we're done. That sounds like we've reached the point of accomplishment. We've done everything we set out to do. And in fact, that's the phrase, that exact phrase appears for the very first time in the context of Dvarim, the building of the Beit HaMikdash. In Dvarim Perek Yud Bet, it talks about the various idolatrous cultures that have built idolatries and built temples on every hill and every place. Polytheistic cultures can have poly temples. Monotheistic religions have to have one temple. Lo tasun ken l'Hashem Elokechem, ki im al makom she'yivchar Hashem Elokechem mikol shiftechem lasum shmo sham shichnot tidrushu uvat shama. We are one God, one temple, one place to serve God. Now that one place can be anywhere. It could be a Mishkan, and it can be moved from place to place. However, לא תעשו ככל שאנחנו עושים פה היום איש כל ישר בעיניו יעשה, כי לא באתם עדת על המנוחה ועל הנחלה שהשם אלוקיך נתן לך. You have not yet come to the place of the inheritance, to the place of rest, the place in which God has given you a permanent presence. Whereas, ועברתם את הירדן, this is in Dvarim Yud Bet, when you cross the Yarden, וישבתם בארץ אשר השם אלוקיכם מנחיל אתכם, and you will dwell in the land that God has given you. When God will give you rest from all of your enemies around you, and you will dwell securely. That's exactly the same phrase that we just had. Right? That's exactly the phrase. Says the Torah. But then then God will choose one place in which to serve God and to bring the Mishkan. And for all intents and purposes, you could draw the link from here, Dvarim Yud Bet, to Yeshua Yechav Gimel, And say we've reached the end of the journey. Now it's time for the makom sheyivchar Hashem, for the place that God will choose. And so we have a permanent place for the Mishkan. Where is that permanent place? Where is the Mishkan currently? Where did he set it up? In Shiloh. And there it can remain in Shiloh forever, because we've reached that moment. So there's a little bit of a challenge here in terms of trying to understand what this phrase means. On the one hand, the gap between what the rest of the parak describes, which is this all the challenges of the nations that still are before them, and the need to conquer them, and the need to settle the land, and the need to remove the idolatry from the land. On the other hand, the parak begins with, we've reached the point of time in which God has given them rest from all of their enemies surrounding them, which is exactly what the Torah describes as the prelude prerequisite for the building of the Beit HaMikdash. In fact, David HaMelech, when he wants to build the Beit HaMikdash, took exactly that phrase and understood it in the context of his mandate. In Shmuel Bet, Parak Zayin, where David asks to build the Beit HaMikdash, that's exactly how the parak begins. Vayhi ki yeshav hamelech beveito. The king dwelt in his house. V'Hashem hiniach lo misaviv mikol oivav. And God had given him rest from all of his enemies. It's exactly the same phrase. He turns to Natan and Navi and he says, I am sitting in a house of cedar. The ark of God is sitting in a tent. It's time to build the Beit HaMikdash. We're not going to unpack the rest of the parak, because why God says no to him is a complicated story. But at least from David's perspective, he took this introduction that the wars were over as an indication that this is the moment we've reached. So the answer, there's really only one way to break this down, but I think it's important to point out that there's a distinction to be made between, let me come back to that phrase, environment bet, ki lo batem ad ata el haminucha ve'el hanachala. Chazal point this out already, and we looked at it back in Parak Yud, that there's a distinction between minucha and nachala. Minucha means rest. Nachala means inheritance, meaning minucha can be temporary. You can have minucha today, and that minucha can be uprooted tomorrow. Nachala has a more permanent message that it carries with it. El minucha ve'el nachala. So from that perspective, one could say that they've reached minucha, they've reached a moment of peace or a moment of success in this campaign, which they certainly have. But there's still work to be done. They haven't yet reached Nachala. And so from that perspective, they have a Mishkan in Shiloh, and they have the tribes in their land, and they have many of the pieces that are needed. They're still not at the end of the journey yet. They still have a ways to go to unite the tribes, to end the threat of the enemies, to bring the point where they can build the Beit HaMikdash. Even David, who thought that was the moment, was told, no, it's not. That moment is not there yet. But
in Devarim, it also says Yishavtem Vetach, and it doesn't repeat that in Yehoshua.
Correct. So, but Yishavtem Vetach, I think, has more of a connotation of V'sheniach L'Hashem Yisrael M'kol Avehem than the Nachala. Yishavtem Vetach can also be temporary. But yes, that phrase also doesn't appear in any of the subsequent phrases, but it's more synonymous with Hashem Niach Lahem Yisrael Mikol Oivehem Misavid. So that's one perspective, meaning that they, from the perspective of from the vantage point of, have they reached a point where that can enable them to establish the Mishkan in Shiloh? Yes, that's the point. They've reached the point in their story that at least fulfills this mandate to the point where they can build the Mishkan in Shiloh, where they can begin to feel that that God has led them to this point where they have a presence in the land. There's still work to be done, and that's the remaining part of the parak, And that's why they're not at the end of the journey yet. They're not at the place where they can build the Beit HaMikdash or Malchut Yisrael or any of the, right? There's still much yet to happen, but they've reached this point from the vantage point of being able to build the Mishkan in Shiloh. That's this phrase. And yes, that they've reached. That's one way to look at this perspective. The other possibility, and I share this with you as a kind of an open-ended possibility, is that there's a difference between the perspective of the political leadership of Israel, no matter who they be, even Yehoshua, and ultimately the fact that their vision is limited and they don't see the whole picture. In other words, Yehoshua may see that and so he may see that they've been successful, and he may be describing that to the people. But there is a vantage point that goes beyond what they can see. And from the perspective of God, there's still yet a lot to be unpacked and a lot to be done. And if you look at various points in history, like David HaMelech, for example, you see that David had a perspective where he thought we had reached the end of the journey. We had reached that point where it's time to build the Beit HaMikdash. And even the Navi thought that that was the case. And then God says to them, no, there's a broader canvas here that you're not seeing. And so that's also part of the story, is that there's a broader canvas. There's still work to be done. Yeshua is alluding to it, that has yet to take place. And even if you think you've reached the end of the journey, you think God has done everything that he set out to do, that all the promises have been fulfilled, and we've reached the end of that journey, maybe not. Maybe there's still, cannot let down our guard. There's still work to be done. The one who is most guilty of not seeing this distinction between political leader's perspective and God's perspective is Shlomo HaMelech, because Shlomo HaMelech, who actually did build the Beit HaMikdash, right? Shlomo HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash, and Shlomo HaMelech also uses this phrase, "V'atah haniach Hashem li Elokai, Hashem Elokai li misaviv." God has enabled me, has brought me peace, has removed all my enemies from before me, enabled me both Melech Israel and to build the Beit HaMikdash. Right, so now Shlomo HaMelech feels he's reached the end of this. He's reached the climax of this process, that he's actually succeeded. He adds a phrase which is going to come back to haunt him. Ein Satan ve'ein pekara. There is neither adversary nor evil. We've reached Nirvana. We've reached the end of the journey. This is it. We built the Beit HaMikdash, or about to build the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore it's time to build the Beit HaMikdash. Reach that point, there's no more enemies to fight. Ein Satan ve'ein pega. There is no adversary. Let's build the Beit HaMikdash. Why is that going to come back to haunt him? Because nobody was guilty of this overconfidence in the reading of the moment more than Shlomo himself. And even Shlomo, who built the Beit HaMikdash and was enabled now to build the Beit HaMikdash, when it came to the end of the journey, at the end of his life, he himself unfortunately fails. And at the end of it all, in Perek Yud Aleph, HaMelech Shlomo ahav nashim nachuyot, he marries many wives in his political marriages, and the nations that we were told not to marry, and he married them, and he was convinced that they wouldn't lead him astray, but they did lead him astray. Right? We know the story. Ultimately led to the split of the kingdom. What I wanted to point out is one phrase in Pasuk Yud Daled. In response, Vayakim Hashem Satan li Shlomo. God sent an adversary to Shlomo. And there are three adversaries, or three Satanim that Hashem sends in the course of what happens in the rest of this parak. The use of the term Satan here is very odd, very out of character. I think it's intentional, because it's a direct response to Shlomo's overconfidence in Perek Hay, where it says that Shlomo said, "Oh, God has brought me respite from all my enemies. Ein Satan ve'en pega. There's no adversary. There's no threat. I'm good. I'm done. I'm ready. Build a Beit HaMikdash. Everything. We've reached the end of the journey. You never reach the end of the journey. You can never let your laurels down. You can never be that confident that says there's nothing more that I need to do. Right? That's exactly the recipe of the Yetzer Hara to destroy what you've accomplished, and that's what happens to Yehoshua. That's what happens to Shlomo, which is why I think the word Satan here is very apropos. Shlomo uses it first, and God responds by saying, "Okay, you think there's no Satan? In response, we're going to bring your punishment is going to be formulated in exactly the same words as was what you initially suggested, which is Ein Satan, Vayakam Hashem, Satan Lishlomo." So coming back to our parak, I think the message here is, yes, they've reached a pause point. They've reached a point where they can say, we've accomplished a great deal, but they haven't finished the job. And the rest of this parak will be a warning between Yehoshua and the elders of Israel that because they haven't finished the job, they have to keep their guard up. They have to remain aware of the threat that the Canaanite culture of idolatry poses to them, and remove that. For that, they're going to need a long journey of Chazaktem Ma'od, be very strong and courageous, as God had said to Yehoshua back in the very first parak of the Sefer, Rak Chazak Mematz Me'od. Okay, I will stop here, and happy to take questions.
What's glaring, he follows everything of Moshe Rabbeinu, and from the middle of Bamidbar, Moshe realizes he needs a successor. That seems to lead to 400 years of chaos. Yehoshua never appoints a successor.
Yehoshua never appoints a successor. That is true. But that's not the difference between Yehoshua and Moshe in terms of successor. To some extent, Yehoshua does appoint a successor. The successor to Yehoshua is not a leader. The successor to Yehoshua is
the Shoftim.
Right, the leaders of every tribe. In other words, the difference was that Moshe's job Yehoshua's job was to lead the nation of Israel and the army of Israel into a national campaign to conquer the land. We're not yet ready for Malchut Yisrael. And the next model of leadership that's going to be at the core of the story is tribal, regional. Each tribe will have their own leader, like the Nasi of each Shevet. Moshe had a Nasi of each Shevet. Yehoshua will establish Nisim of each Shevet. So from that perspective, he does prepare the leadership, except that it's not national, it's regional, or it's tribal. Whether that succeeds or fails is to be seen. But that's the message of Sefer Shoftim, is that the first effort of leadership is going to be based on each tribe on their own. And that could have succeeded. It didn't. And so because it failed, we ended up with the need for a national leadership, which has its own drawbacks and its own successes, strengths and weaknesses. But that's exactly the question of the balance between regional tribal leadership and national leadership. It's the same challenge, the same question that every government, every country, especially in modern times, has been made up of local, regional areas and the national leadership, right? What is the power base, the struggle between national and between, let's call it federal and state government in the United States, or it's the same, or federal and provincial government in Canada. It's the same issue. How much power do you
Australia or Germany or anything else like that, or India, Brazil.
Exactly. It's the same challenge you're going to get in any context in which you have both regional groups and a national group. And that's exactly the challenge that Yehoshua faced. So the first effort was tribal, and only when that really fails does the need for Malchus emerge.
Right.
You have to remember also, and we'll talk about this at length in Sefer Shoftim, the concept of Malchus in Tanakh does not mean, it's not a connotation of, or it's not a contrast to democracy, right? There's no such thing as democracy in the time of Tanakh because it doesn't exist yet. hasn't been invented. The word hasn't been invented. The concept hasn't been invented. Right? The models of leadership in Tanakh are either tribal or national. That's called shofet or melech. However power base you put there, but that's the difference between, those are the two models, either regional, shofet / nasi, or national, called melech. And those are the only options that you have at that time. Okay?
Thank you very much.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
I hope you have a wonderful week. B'ezrat Hashem, we will see you all next week. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll be back in Israel. So for me, it will be an evening share. For you all, time remains the same. Have a great week.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Hmm.